Frank Delaney hadn't planned on staying up past midnight, but something about the silence made it harder to sleep these days. The house groaned with the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, it felt final. He sat in his old recliner, the one that still smelled faintly of the popcorn he and his wife used to eat during Friday movie nights. But she'd been gone 5 years, and the only popcorn now came in microwave bags with a flavor called buttery style that tasted nothing like real butter. Frank was on his second one, half-finished, cold, and mostly crumbs in the bowl resting on his lap. The television flickered, the glow reflecting off framed photos on the nearby wall, his wedding day, a shot of his daughter Erin on the swings when she was 5, and a faded picture of him standing in front of the high school media lab he ran for 30 years. Back when film meant film, and editing required razor blades and tape. Tonight, he wasn't really watching anything. YouTube had become his background noise, and the autoplay had led him into a strange spiral of videos he didn't recognize. Interviews, startup pitches, some man talking about AI robots that could fold laundry. His eyelids were just starting to droop when it hit. The title appeared in stark white text against a black background, The Astronaut's Regret, created by Neuroframe AI. At first, he almost clicked away. The thumbnail looked like some cheap CGI space scene. But then the music started, subtle, cinematic, unsettling. Something in his chest tightened. The narrator's voice wasn't real, Frank could tell that much, but it was close enough to feel human. Too close. The story followed a retired astronaut named Cole who'd once walked on Mars but had grown old and bitter, living alone in a house that echoed with memories. He watched videos of his younger self on repeat, wondering where the time had gone. The AI-generated visuals weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. There was something raw in them, something that slipped past the usual defenses. At the end, the character whispered, "I went to space, but I never made peace with Earth." And then, silence. A black screen. White text again. Created entirely by Neuroframe AI. No Hollywood. No crew. Just vision. Frank's hand trembled on the remote. It wasn't the astronaut. It wasn't the space stuff. It was how much it felt like his life. Like someone had peeked into the dusty corners of his soul, pulled out the bits he'd buried, and made a film about it. How the hell could an algorithm know that he too had stopped living in the present? That he sat night after night reliving old glories, lectures he gave, student films he once graded, laughter from a house that didn't echo back anymore. He stood up slowly, popcorn spilling onto the floor, but he didn't care. He walked to the hallway mirror and looked at himself, really looked. The lines around his eyes weren't just from age. They were from time not spent. The dreams he used to talk about, like directing his own short film, had all become memories of intentions. Nothing made. Nothing finished. Nothing shared. His heart thudded. Not with fear, but something else. A spark. Not even a flame. Just the sound of a match striking in the dark. He sat back down and opened his laptop. Dust puffed from between the keys. It had been weeks since he'd used it for anything beyond banking or crossword puzzles. He typed Neuroframe AI into the search bar. The website was sleek, black and silver, with a tagline in bold, "Create what others say you can't." Age doesn't matter. Vision does. There was a quote at the top, too, from Elon Musk himself, "The world only changes when someone refuses to stop building it." Frank stared at it for a long time. Elon had always struck him as a little crazy, maybe too bold, but this? This felt like something he could understand. Build. Not for them. For me. He scrolled past dozens of video examples. Some made by teenagers, others by war veterans, single mothers, retirees, even one by a blind musician who used AI to visualize sound. Every clip had one thing in common: they weren't perfect, but they were alive. Frank's cursor hovered over the sign up button. He hesitated. Then clicked. Just like that. No fanfare. No dramatic music. Just a quiet decision made in a quiet room by a man who used to think his story was over. The platform asked him for a username. He typed "Bold Dog New Frames." He smirked. It accepted. Inside, he saw the interface, a layout designed to be intuitive. Even friendly. "Start with your vision," it said. "We'll help you shape it." Frank's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He thought back to the one script he'd started and never finished. Second Moon. It had been a metaphor, of course, a story about an aging man who sees a new moon appear in the sky and wonders if it's a sign he has more to live for. He'd written the first scene, once. On paper. In longhand. Probably still somewhere in the garage. He stood, bones creaking, and headed into the cold, cluttered abyss of what used to be his workshop. It smelled of sawdust, oil, and time. After digging through old boxes, photo albums, and tangled cords, he found it. A yellowed folder labeled "Second Moon, Draft 1." He opened it with shaking hands. The writing was rough, the ink smudged, but it was his. Every word. He brought it back inside like it was a sacred artifact. Back at the laptop, he typed the opening line into Neuroframe. An old man stares at the night sky and sees something no one else can. The system responded instantly. "What mood should we create?" it asked. He clicked, bittersweet. Then lonely. Then hopeful. Within seconds, AI-generated visuals appeared, a silhouetted figure beneath a purple sky, stars blinking overhead, a strange second orb rising beside the moon. The music was slow, haunting. The narrator's voice, soft, gravelly, male, began to speak his line. Frank watched, motionless. It was like holding a mirror up to a piece of himself that had never gotten a chance to breathe. He saved the project. Uploaded it privately. No one needed to see it. Not yet. But he watched it again. And again. And again. Not because it was good. But because it was real. For the first time in years, Frank didn't feel like a spectator in his own life. The spark hadn't become a fire yet, but something had changed. He didn't know if it was just a phase, a passing interest, or the beginning of something bigger. But when he finally stood up to go to bed, he felt taller. Lighter. Less invisible. He turned off the lights. The TV screen still glowed faintly in the dark, paused on the final frame of the astronaut's regret. White letters on black again. "You're never too old to build a future worth watching." Frank smiled. "We'll see," he whispered. Upstairs, the house creaked again. But this time, it didn't sound like goodbye. It sounded like a beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning sun crept in through the kitchen blinds, casting lines across the countertop where toast crumbs from 3 days ago still clung to the laminate. Frank moved slowly, not from pain exactly, but from the kind of heaviness that came from too many mornings that felt the same. He filled the kettle halfway, flicked on the burner, and waited, leaning on the counter with both hands. His bones reminded him he wasn't 40 anymore, and his reflection in the microwave confirmed it. The stubble was white now, not gray. The eyes a little duller. But behind them, something flickered, a remnant from last night. He walked back to the living room while the water heated, stepping over a pair of sneakers he hadn't worn since last spring. On the recliner sat the yellowed folder, still open, "Second Moon," in big block letters on top. It looked older than it was, like it had aged out of guilt. He touched it again, ran a finger over the crease where the corner had bent. The paper felt both familiar and foreign, like bumping into an old friend and realizing you no longer know what to say. His mind traveled backward, not in dramatic cinematic flashbacks, but in flashes, moments stitched together like a montage. The first time he'd taught film studies in 1983, pulling the wheeled TV cart into room 204. The smell of chalk, the sound of the VCR clicking into place. Kids with eyes wide open, watching Casablanca like it was new. Back then, he believed every kid had a story to tell. That's what got him into teaching. He couldn't make his own films, not with a baby on the way and a mortgage, but he could help others tell theirs. And he did. He ran that media lab like it was his own private studio, editing bays, green screens before they were popular, old camcorders bought on grant money and repaired with duct tape. Every spring, he helped students create short films for the local youth festival. Sci-fi, mystery, coming-of-age dramas with too much voiceover, he loved every second. The late nights, the rewrites, the excitement when a scene finally clicked. But somewhere along the way, those moments had started to fade. The last film he shot himself was on mini DV in 2001, a short documentary about his neighbor's tulip garden. The footage still sat in a drawer, unedited. His own creative work had always come second. And when Margaret got sick, second became never. She'd always encouraged him, though. Even when they didn't have money, even when he'd stay up late tinkering with lighting setups in the garage, she believed in what he called his retired dream. After she passed, the dream became a sore spot. He didn't want to see it, let alone feel it. That's why the garage stayed closed. That's why the old cameras collected dust. Until last night. The kettle screamed from the kitchen. Frank turned it off and poured water over a sad-looking tea bag, stirring slowly as if that made it stronger. He sat down at the table, sipping, the warmth spreading through him. He opened the laptop again. The Neuroframe project was still there, Scene 1, Draft 1. He watched it again. The old man under the second moon. The way the colors bled into each other. The way the voice, artificial but somehow still real, said the line he'd written 30 years ago. It wasn't perfect. But it was a beginning. He clicked through the site some more, reading stories from other creators. One woman in Montana, 67, had recreated scenes from her childhood using AI-generated images and narration. A retired truck driver in Texas had made a Western short about his father. None of them were filmmakers by trade. Just people who still had stories and finally had a way to tell them. Frank scrolled to a comments section beneath one of the more popular videos. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The question lingered in his head. What pushed him forward? For the longest time, nothing had. Not until last night. Not until he felt that strange mix of regret and hope again. He minimized the window and opened an old folder on his hard drive labeled Teaching Stuff. Inside, hundreds of lesson plans, media projects, and scripts written by his former students. He clicked on one from 2005, Eclipse, a sci-fi thriller made by a kid named Jordan who later went to film school in LA. The file opened with a still image of the final shot, the Earth eclipsed by a shadowy planet. He remembered filming that in the school parking lot using a flashlight and a globe. That had been one of the best years. A knock at the door startled him. No one came by anymore. Not unannounced. He opened it to find Mary Hastings, his neighbor across the street, holding a casserole dish. "Thought you might want something hot," she said. "You looked a little pale yesterday." Frank smiled, a little caught off guard. "Thanks, Mary. I was just working on something." "Working?" "At your age," she said, half joking. He chuckled. "Trying something new." She handed over the dish, still warm through the towel. "Well, just don't break a hip doing it." She waved as she walked back across the street, her little dog yapping at her heels. Frank closed the door and set the dish down, but her words stuck. At your age. It wasn't cruel. It was just real. People expected men like him to settle. To fade. To sit in recliners and remember. But remembering wasn't enough. Not anymore. He opened the garage again that afternoon. Not just for nostalgia this time. He moved boxes, uncovered his old tripod, found the light kit he'd bought from a clearance bin at Radio Shack. He plugged in the camera, dead. Of course. But in the drawer were 2 batteries. One of them held a charge. He attached it, looked through the viewfinder, and for the first time in over a decade, he saw the world in frames again. The lighting was bad. The autofocus jittered. But it didn't matter. He filmed a shot of himself walking into the garage. Then one of his hand brushing dust off the camera. He pulled it into the newer frame editor and began playing. Music options popped up. He chose something minimal. Then added a line of narration, "Sometimes we don't know what we've lost until we hold it again." The AI generated the voice, a soft baritone with just a hint of age. He watched the 1-minute clip, then posted it anonymously. Just to see. Just to put something out there. That night, he got 9 views. Then 16. Then 22. One comment, "This made me cry. Reminds me of my dad." Frank stared at that sentence. It didn't say much. But it said everything. Someone out there had felt something. From him. From a moment he created. From a voice that hadn't been heard in decades. The thought made his eyes sting. He looked at the clock. Midnight again. The house was quiet. But this time, it didn't feel empty. He shut the laptop and went to bed. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about what to shoot tomorrow. And for the first time in a long, long time, the darkness around him didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something new. Frank didn't hear the wind at first. The windows rattled just slightly against the early spring storm, but he was too deep into editing a new sequence to notice. The footage was simple, a pair of gloved hands opening an old film canister, the faded label reading, "Memories, 1989. It was all staged, of course, since he hadn't used film in decades, but the image still felt heavy with meaning. He added a low synth drone beneath it, watched the preview loop again, then sat back in his chair and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Outside, thunder cracked. The lights flickered. The screen went dark. "No, no, no," he muttered, panic rising as he jabbed the power button on the laptop. The room dimmed with nothing but the faint blue of his emergency battery pack glowing in the corner. A second later, the power surged back. His heart slowed. The computer rebooted, and thankfully, Neuroframe had autosaved. He sat back again, rubbing his temple. He wasn't sure why he'd gotten so worked up. It wasn't like the clip was a masterpiece. But still, he had needed it to work. Not for views. Not even for pride. Just to prove to himself that he could still do something new. Still make something that lived outside his own memory. That afternoon, he had a checkup scheduled. He almost cancelled, but something told him to keep it. Maybe the lingering headache. Maybe the throb in his hip that hadn't fully gone away since he slipped on the ice 3 months ago. The waiting room was quiet, with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and a woman 2 chairs over coughing into a tissue. He scrolled through Neuroframe on his phone, watched someone else's AI film about a widower who talked to his wife's garden gnome. It was absurd, touching, and weirdly profound. He saved it to show Erin, then remembered she hadn't answered his last message. Dr. Chen called him in. She was kind, young, maybe early 30s, with calm eyes and a voice that tried too hard to be cheerful. After the usual checks and questions, she tapped a few notes into her tablet and said, "So, Frank, how are you spending your time lately?" He told her he was doing some video work, some digital storytelling. Her eyebrows rose. "Oh. Like with a phone?" He shook his head. "Something more advanced." AI tools. Editing, narration. That sort of thing. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. That's unexpected. Unexpected good or unexpected why bother? She laughed lightly, awkwardly. No, I think it's great. Most of my older patients aren't experimenting with technology. They're focused on winding down. Winding down, Frank repeated, the word sitting heavy on his chest. Do you think I should be? She paused, then glanced at his chart. Well, you've had some mild blood pressure issues, and I'd recommend not overexerting yourself. At your age, balance is key. But if this keeps your mind sharp and your spirits up, I don't see the harm. He smiled politely, but inside, something twisted. At your age, again. As if 65 was the expiration date on ambition. As if 72 meant you were only allowed to watch the world move on, not contribute to it. He thanked her, left with his prescription refills, and sat in his car for a few minutes before starting the engine. Rain spattered against the windshield, blurring the edges of the world outside. A little voice inside whispered, "What's the point?" He drove slowly through the neighborhood on the way home, past houses that looked identical to his, modest, aging, lonely. He imagined the people inside, watching daytime television, arguing about politics, dozing off during the evening news. Had he become one of them? A man tinkering with a lost dream, clinging to relevance through artificial means. He parked, sat in the driveway for a long time. Inside, the house was cold. He didn't turn on the lights. Just walked to the living room, sat on the edge of the recliner, and stared at the TV screen, still paused on a frame from the last video he watched. An AI-generated image of a child in a red coat looking up at a sky filled with multiple moons. Impossible, but beautiful. Frank shook his head. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe he should just go back to reading detective novels and taking walks around the block. He thought of calling Aaron, but what would he say? That he was feeling lost again? That the spark he'd found last week was already flickering? He opened the laptop again out of habit more than desire. The Neuroframe homepage had a new video at the top. Top picks today. The thumbnail showed Elon Musk, his face lit by a console screen, looking intense. Frank clicked. It was a podcast clip from a recent tech summit. Elon was answering a question about creativity and age. People think creativity belongs to the young, Musk said. But I think we're wrong about that. Creativity belongs to anyone brave enough to challenge what they're told. That doesn't fade with age, it just gets buried under routine. Our AI tools aren't about replacing people. They're about digging out those buried sparks. Helping people finish what they started. Or start what they were too scared to try. Frank leaned forward. Musk continued. The most powerful creators in the next decade might be people you'd least expect. People with stories that have been percolating for 40, 50 years. Give them the right tools, and they'll outcreate Hollywood. Because what they'll have is depth. The clip ended. Frank sat there in silence. A flicker returned. Not a fire, but a challenge. Finish what you started. He clicked over to his drafts. Second Moon, Scene 2, still had nothing written. He opened the script window and typed, slowly, the man climbs to the roof with a telescope he hasn't used in years. It's cloudy. But he watches anyway. He generated visuals. A gray rooftop. The silhouette of a man. Clouds drifting like ghosts. He added music, strings, low and mournful. Then narration, he didn't know what he was looking for. Just that he had to keep looking. He hit render and sat back. This wasn't for an audience. This was for the ache inside. The one that told him not to settle. That whispered, even on the worst days, you're still here. You're still here. The video rendered in minutes. He uploaded it privately, then shared the link with one person, Erin. He didn't add a message. Just sent it. If she watched, she'd understand. And if she didn't, well, he'd keep making them anyway. Because it wasn't about being seen. It was about creating something that proved he was still alive. Frank woke with the weight of expectation pressed gently against his chest, not anxiety exactly, but the strange lightness that comes from purpose rediscovered. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, and morning light trickled through the slats in his blinds like a film reel opening to its first frame. He hadn't heard from Erin, no text, no call, but he didn't let the silence sink its claws in the way it used to. Instead, he made coffee, not instant this time but the good kind, the kind that required patience, the kind Margaret used to make on Sundays when they had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. The smell filled the kitchen, pushed back the stillness. Mug in hand, he went straight to the laptop, half expecting to find nothing new, but his heart skipped as he saw the notification icon blinking red. One new comment. One new message. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked. It was from a username he didn't recognize, at MemoryRoot27, but the message began with two words that reached through the screen and squeezed his lungs. Dad. Wow. It was Erin. She didn't sign her name, didn't say anything else, just those two words and a heart emoji, and that was enough to knock something loose in him. He stared at the screen, reread it 5 times, then leaned back and exhaled. It wasn't a phone call, but it was a crack in the ice. A glimmer. A beginning. He clicked back to the project file. Second Moon had become more than just a story. It had turned into a mirror he wasn't afraid to look into. Scene 3 was empty, waiting. He knew what came next. The man in the story. His stand-in, his fictional shadow, would start talking to someone. Not a person, exactly, but a memory. Maybe a recording. Maybe a ghost. Frank typed, "The old man rewinds a tape marked June 17, 1987. He presses play. A woman's voice fills the room. He let the AI build the scene. The visuals appeared, a dusty room, a vintage tape deck, flickering light from a small lamp. He selected a female voice that sounded like an older version of Margaret, not perfect, but close enough to ache. The system auto-filled a line of dialogue based on the mood and theme. The voice said softly, "You always wanted to find meaning in the stars. But you forgot to look at what was right in front of you." Frank watched it and felt tears well behind his eyes. He didn't stop them. He let them come. Not out of sadness, but out of recognition. He had spent so long chasing unfinished dreams that he had forgotten how to make peace with the parts of his life that were already beautiful. He saved the scene, uploaded the latest version of Second Moon to his private archive, and then, after a long moment of hesitation, he clicked the option to publish it publicly on the Neuroframe community feed. The system asked if he wanted to add a creator's note. He typed, "This story took me 40 years to finish. And maybe that's exactly how long it needed." He hit post. There was no fanfare, no applause. Just silence and the small thrill of knowing it was out there. A digital message in a bottle, floating in the vast sea of stories. That afternoon, he walked to the park for the first time in months. The wind tugged at his jacket and the trees were already starting to turn. A few teenagers sat on a bench staring at their phones. One of them glanced up as he passed. For a second, Frank felt invisible again, like the older man fading into the background of a world that no longer had room for him. But then the kid smiled. "Hey, are you old dog new frames?" Frank blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah," he said, almost uncertainly. The kid turned to his friend. "Dude, that Second Moon short. That was wild. The voiceover gave me chills." Frank chuckled awkwardly. "Thanks. That means a lot." They nodded, went back to their scrolling, but something had changed. The world hadn't forgotten him. Not entirely. He walked home slower, feeling each step with more weight, more pride. That night, he sat in the garage with the door open. The sky above was cloudy, no stars in sight, but he brought out his old telescope anyway. Not to look, but to remember. To sit beside a piece of himself that he had almost left behind. His phone buzzed. Another message from Aaron. This time longer. Watched the full thing. Seen with the tape, that was Mom's voice, wasn't it? Not really, but it felt like her. I didn't know you were still working on that script. Or that it meant so much to you. I'm sorry I haven't been around more. Life's complicated. But I'm proud of you. Seriously. Frank swallowed hard, then typed back. It's okay. Life is always complicated. I'm just glad you saw it. She responded immediately. Can we talk soon? He stared at the words, nodded to himself, then typed, anytime. He set the phone down and looked out at the cloudy night sky. He didn't need to see the stars to know they were still there. The next morning, he checked the stats. Over 2,000 views. 78 comments. Messages from strangers, retirees, young kids, single parents, old teachers. One man said he'd shown it to his film class. Another woman wrote, "This made me feel like my grandfather's voice had come back for a minute." Frank sat quietly, reading each one. He didn't feel famous. He didn't feel viral. He felt seen. And that was enough. He started drafting a new project that same afternoon. Not a sequel. Something else. A story about a man building a small rocket in his backyard. Fiction, mostly. But like all good stories, rooted in something true. He called it, Launch Window. As he typed, he remembered something Elon Musk said in that podcast clip, the part that stuck with him most. When you think your story's over, that's usually the moment something incredible is trying to begin. You just have to be curious enough to see it. Frank smiled. Curious enough. That he could do. That he still had. The screen glowed with possibility. The cursor blinked. And with every word, he moved further away from the edge of fading, and closer to the place where futures, real or imagined, still had room to grow. Frank no longer needed an alarm clock. Not because his body woke naturally, but because his mind had begun firing like it used to decades ago, when he'd wake up with an idea so vivid it practically dragged him out of bed. That morning was no different. The moment his eyes opened, the words were already there, the man who built a rocket from memory. He whispered them aloud, letting them settle into the still air of the house, and then, as quickly as his knees would allow, shuffled toward the kitchen, not for breakfast, but for his yellow legal pad. He hadn't used it in years, not since the first draft of Second Moon. It still had his old shorthand in the margins, arrows pointing to nothing, underlines for emphasis, and a smudge of coffee where Margaret once placed her mug by mistake. He sat at the table and began to write longhand, letting the scene unfold without planning it, just instinct. The character's name came fast, Walter. A quiet man in his late 70s, retired, forgotten, living in a house filled with old tools and lost time. But what made Walter different was that every night, he dreamt about a rocket launch, and every morning, he sketched out what he saw, until one day he started building it in real life. Frank scribbled with urgency, his handwriting messy but legible. The story was part fantasy, part truth, an echo of the feeling he now carried every day, the desire to build something before time ran out. He paused only when his hand began to cramp, looked up at the clock, and realized 3 hours had passed. The room was filled with sunlight now, sharp and golden, cutting across the dust like a camera tracking a slow pan across an old set. He stood, stretched, and walked to the garage, not out of habit but intention. He knew now this space wasn't just storage, it was a studio again. He cleared off the main work table, made space for his laptop, and carefully placed the legal pad beside it. On Neuroframe, he clicked New Project and typed the title in all caps, Launch Window. The interface opened and immediately offered templates based on previous work, but Frank selected Start from Scratch. He wanted this one to be different, slower, more visual, more emotional. He uploaded a photo of his own workbench to use as the reference set, then generated an image of an older man sketching a rocket blueprint under a swinging lamp. It appeared instantly, weathered hands, graphite on paper, a cup of coffee half full, a faint glow from an old radio in the background. Perfect. For narration, he hesitated. He didn't want to use the same voice as Second Moon. He wanted Walter to sound a little rougher, like he'd lived a little harder. He picked a voice labeled Rust_Male 60s_Gravel Warm and typed the opening line. They told him rockets were for younger men, but dreams don't check birth certificates. He hit preview. The voice read it back perfectly, with a slow, deliberate pace. Frank's chest tightened, not in fear this time, but in awe. It was like watching something sacred take shape from smoke. He added a slow piano underscore, adjusted the lighting on the generated shot, and built a second scene, Walter clearing a patch of backyard, placing an old piece of aluminum on sawhorses, measuring twice, cutting once. The visuals took shape in real time, and Frank found himself lost in the process, smiling like a teenager editing film in a dark lab with reels and tape and spliced hope. That night, he showed Erin the first draft over a video call. She'd started calling regularly again, always in the evening, always asking, "What are you working on now, Dad?" It became their rhythm, him showing scenes, her reacting honestly, never overhyping, never sugarcoating. She told him the first draft was promising but needed a real emotional hook, something to make Walter more than just a metaphor. Frank nodded, knowing she was right. He went back in and added a photo frame into the background, a young boy in the 1960s, standing beside a model rocket, smiling. He added a new voiceover line. He didn't build it for the sky. He built it for the memory of who he used to be. The scene changed instantly. It was no longer about a man building a rocket. It was about a man reclaiming a part of himself that had gone quiet. Frank sat back and just breathed. It amazed him how deeply these small changes could cut. How, with the right framing, even the impossible could feel intimate. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Neuroframe featured launch window on their homepage. Frank's phone buzzed non-stop. Comments poured in. One user wrote, "This is what AI should be used for, bringing old souls back to life." Another said, "My dad's 78 and spent the last year building a telescope from scratch. Showed him this. He cried." Frank read them all. Every single one. And with each comment, he felt that old version of himself, the teacher, the creator, the dreamer, wake up a little more. He messaged Erin, "People are watching." She replied within seconds, "Of course they are. It's beautiful. Are you okay with the attention?" Frank stared at the message, then typed, "I think I need it." He'd never said that aloud before, but it was true. He needed to be useful again, to feel like what he made mattered, not just to him, but to others. That night, he sat on the porch with a notepad and began sketching out a new story. Not fiction this time. A documentary short about older creators using AI. He wanted to profile people like himself, retired minds with untold stories, forgotten skills, dreams paused by responsibility or tragedy. He titled the project Rewired. He started reaching out to others on the platform, sending kind, respectful messages. "Your work moved me. Would you be willing to talk about your journey?" Some responded quickly. A retired nurse from Oregon. A 70-year-old former coal miner in Pennsylvania who'd created a western using AI-generated saloons and desert plains. A woman from Georgia who had used the tools to recreate the lullabies her mother used to sing. Each story felt like a puzzle piece from a bigger picture, the lie that creativity had an expiration date. Frank spent days gathering clips, editing audio, writing narration. He pushed himself harder than he had in years. He slept less, thought more, even caught himself skipping meals, like he used to do in the film lab back in the day. But he wasn't chasing youth. He was chasing voice. Relevance. Purpose. When Rewired was finished, he uploaded it with shaking hands. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfect. But it was raw and real and filled with faces and voices that the world had stopped listening to. Within hours, the views exploded. By morning, over 20,000. Then 50,000. Then a call. Not a scam. A real call. From a podcast producer based in San Francisco who said, "We'd love to interview you. Your story's important." Frank sat on the edge of his bed, stunned. He whispered, "Is this really happening?" Aaron called moments later. "Dad. You're trending." He laughed. "Didn't even know that was possible at my age." She paused. Maybe age was never the problem. Just opportunity. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had closed up with emotion too heavy to speak. He looked at the screen again. Messages from around the country. Comments from people saying they were picking up their guitar again, dusting off old notebooks, reopening dreams that had gone quiet. One stood out, "I'm 66 and thought I was finished. But after watching Rewired, I'm starting my first short story. Thank you." Frank leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the words wash over him. He thought of Elon Musk, that quote about people who challenge what they're told. That spark, that defiance, that refusal to go quietly. Frank wasn't trying to compete with Hollywood. He was trying to prove that the best stories aren't told in youth, they're earned with time, etched with loss, sculpted by years that take and give back in uneven measure. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too late. Maybe no one was. Frank wasn't expecting anything special when he checked his inbox that morning. Most days, it was the usual flood of spam, appointment reminders, and AI-generated newsletters he didn't remember subscribing to. But today, at the very top, was a subject line that made his heart stop mid-beat: "Your work on Rewired, an invitation from SpaceX Media Lab." He clicked it with shaking hands, half certain it was some scam wrapped in shiny bait, but the email was real. It was short, direct, and signed with a name, Dana Kim, Director of Outreach, SpaceX Media Lab, a new initiative Musk himself had recently greenlit to explore narrative storytelling powered by AI, memory, and what they called deep future nostalgia. Dana had seen Rewired. She wrote that it struck a rare chord, timeless, personal, and deeply necessary, and then came the invitation. An offer to fly out to a private SpaceX campus in Austin to join a week-long creative residency focused on older storytellers using AI. All expenses paid. Full access to their newest tools. No catch. Just one request: bring your story. Frank read it again. And again. The first time, he thought it was a mistake. The second, he thought it was a miracle. By the third time, he was breathing shallow, like he had when Aaron was born and someone put her in his arms and said, "She's yours." He picked up the phone and called Aaron without thinking. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." He couldn't contain it. "SpaceX. Austin. They want me. For a residency." They saw the film. Silence, then, "Wait, what? Are you serious?" He read the email aloud. When he finished, Aaron let out a laugh that turned into a small, teary sound. "Dad, that's, holy crap. That's huge." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I don't know if I can go." "Why not?" "I haven't flown in 10 years. I haven't left the state in almost 20. I don't know anyone there. What if I get there and realize I'm out of my depth?" Aaron was quiet for a beat. "Dad. You've been out of your depth your whole life. That's where you thrive. Frank smiled, a small, humbled smile. You really think I can do this? You already are. Just say yes. And so he did. He replied to Dana's email, accepted the invitation, and within 48 hours, he had a ticket, an itinerary, and a packing list that included nothing but comfortable shoes, your laptop, and an open mind. The days leading up to the trip moved like molasses and lightning at the same time. Frank spent hours second-guessing what to pack, whether to bring his old notebook, how many hard drives he should carry. He didn't sleep much, not because of nerves, but because his mind refused to slow down. He kept dreaming in scenes. Rocket parts scattered across a dusty floor, a voice calling out from the stars, a door opening in the side of a mountain that led to a cinema playing memories instead of movies. When the day came, he stood at the gate, passport in hand, looking out at the plane with a sense of awe he hadn't felt since he was a boy watching Apollo missions on black and white TV. The flight was smooth, the air quiet, and the man beside him didn't say a word, which suited Frank just fine. He watched a documentary on Elon Musk during the trip, something he'd seen before, but this time, it hit different. The section where Elon talked about failing with SpaceX, rockets blowing up, the world laughing, investors bailing, and how he kept pushing anyway. There was a line in the interview Frank had never noticed: when something matters enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. That stuck with him. By the time the plane landed, his doubt had melted into something closer to determination. A car picked him up at the airport, sleek, driverless, humming like a living thing, and took him down a road that twisted through rolling hills until it reached a compound that looked like a tech utopia married an art school. Everything was glass and curves, light filtering in from places he couldn't quite locate. Inside, a team greeted him like he mattered. They handed him a badge, showed him to his room, gave him a schedule. Frank wasn't used to being treated like this. Not since he retired. Not since before Margaret passed. He kept waiting for someone to tap him on the shoulder and say, "Sorry, we made a mistake. This was meant for someone younger." But no one did. That first night, there was an informal welcome session. A dozen other guests gathered in a room filled with floating screens and projection walls that responded to motion. Every one of them was over 60. A retired firefighter from Chicago who made AI-powered documentaries about his time on the job. A 68-year-old Cuban-American woman who wrote visual poetry in both languages. A former stage actor who'd lost his voice to surgery but now used synthetic audio to bring old monologues back to life. They shared stories, watched each other's work, and laughed in the way only people with shared grief and quiet pride could. Frank felt something open in him. Not wide. But enough. The next day, they started working. Each of them was paired with a creative tech liaison. Frank's was a young engineer named Malik, who wore glasses too big for his face and always had 3 energy drinks in arm's reach. "We loved Rewired," Malik said on day 1. "But I think Launch Window could go even further. Want to try something wild?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Define wild." "We've got prototype tools no one else has touched. Want to test one? We can feed your writing into a dynamic simulation engine. It won't just generate video, it'll build interactive scenes. Viewers could literally walk into Walter's backyard, explore his workbench, trigger memories based on what they touch." Frank stared at him. "You can do that?" Malik grinned. "With your vision?" "Absolutely." They spent the next 4 days building, testing, adjusting. Frank brought Walter to life like never before. He recorded new dialogue, sketched out a branching storyline where viewers could choose how Walter responded to obstacles. One version ended in triumph. Another in quiet, graceful surrender. Malik called it emotionally divergent realism. Frank just called it life. On the final night, they held a showcase. Everyone's work was played on a 360-degree dome screen, immersive and rich. When Launch Window played, Frank didn't watch the screen, he watched the people. Watched their faces go still, their eyes glisten, their heads nod. When it ended, there was silence. Then applause. Then someone whispered, "That's the kind of story that stays." Frank stood in the dark, hands in his pockets, heart full. He didn't cry. Not then. But that night, in the quiet of his room, he did. Not from sadness. From release. From knowing that the story he thought had died long ago was now alive and flying further than he ever dreamed. Before leaving Austin, Dana pulled him aside. "Frank," she said, "we're building a new program. A mentorship model. We want older creators to guide others. You up for that?" Frank nodded without hesitation. "I'd be honored." On the flight home, he didn't sleep. He just stared out the window at the vastness of the sky and thought of all the other people like him still waiting for permission to start again. He promised himself, right then, that he would find them. That he would help them see what he now knew to be true: there is no age limit on beginning again. When Frank stepped off the plane back home, everything looked the same cracked sidewalk outside the terminal, the same worn fabric on the shuttle seats, the same faded white sedan waiting in the pickup lane. But Frank was not the same. Something had shifted. A tension he'd carried in his shoulders for years was gone, replaced by a quiet electricity running through his veins. He wasn't returning from a vacation or a business trip. He was returning from a resurrection. The car ride home was quiet. He watched the city pass by like a film reel, each light, each pedestrian, each fast food billboard suddenly part of a world he no longer felt invisible inside. When he stepped into the house, he paused at the threshold, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. The walls didn't feel like confinement anymore. They felt like a studio. A lab. A launch pad. He unpacked methodically, placing his badge from the residency on his desk like a trophy. Then, without a second thought, he opened his laptop, connected to NeuroFrame, and began outlining a new project, not a film this time, not even a story. A guide. A series. A kind of course. Something he would have begged for when he first opened the platform and felt like he was trying to learn quantum physics with a pocket calculator. He titled the new project, "Frank Teaches the Internet." He laughed softly at the name, half joke, half truth. The concept was simple. He would walk viewers through everything he had learned: how to craft emotional narratives using AI, how to use visuals with meaning, how to structure scenes that lingered. But most importantly, how to begin again at any age. Not flashy. Not trendy. Just honest. Real. He filmed the first video in his kitchen, using the front-facing camera on his laptop and a stack of books to prop it up. He didn't script it. He just spoke. "Hi. My name's Frank. I'm 72 years old, and I spent most of my adult life thinking my time had passed. That I had missed the window to create something meaningful. But a few months ago, I found a tool that changed that. It's called NeuroFrame. And I want to show you how to use it, not as a young person would, but as someone who's lived." He edited it simply, no effects, no overlays, just his face, his voice, and a few cutaways to footage from Launch Window and Rewired. He uploaded it to NeuroFrame and YouTube with the caption, "For anyone who thought they were too late. You're not." Within a week, the video had over 100,000 views. The comments were endless. "A 66-year-old widow in Vermont, I haven't picked up a paintbrush in 20 years. I'm going to start again. A former Army medic, I want to tell my story, and you just gave me permission." A teenager wrote, "I showed this to my grandpa. He cried. He's signing up for NeuroFrame now." Frank responded to every comment he could. Not out of duty, but out of gratitude. These weren't fans, they were fellow travelers. People waking up to the same truth he had discovered: creativity doesn't die. It just waits. He kept uploading. Week after week. Tutorials. Behind-the-scenes breakdowns. Interviews with other older creators he met through the residency. The channel grew fast, then faster. Soon, it had a name in the AI storytelling world, the Frank Method. Platforms started embedding his clips in their help centers. Podcasters asked him on. One show, Future Roots, called him the grandfather of cinematic AI storytelling. Frank rolled his eyes at the term, but Erin just laughed. "You always wanted a title," she said. "Now you've got one." With each upload, Frank grew bolder. Not just in tone, but in content. He began tackling difficult emotions, regret, grief, aging, using scenes generated in Neuroframe. He'd open with a question, then show how he answered it through story. One video asked, "Can you forgive yourself after 40 years?" It told the story of a man revisiting the garage where he'd once built model planes with his son, his real son, now estranged. It ended with no resolution, only silence, and the image of the man placing a finished model on the porch with a note that said, "Still flying." That video went viral across platforms. Over 3 million views. Comments poured in from parents and children. "This made me call my dad after 10 years. I thought it was too late. Now I'm not sure." Frank didn't try to be a therapist. He didn't give advice. He just told stories. And somehow, that became enough. One morning, as he was recording an episode about structuring nonlinear narratives, he received a text from Dana at SpaceX. Elon saw the video. The one with the garage and the plane. He called it essential. Frank stared at the message. "Read it twice." Then simply typed back, "Tell him thank you. And tell him I'm not done yet." After that, SpaceX invited him back, not as a resident this time, but as a guest mentor. They were developing a new cohort, and they wanted Frank to help shape the curriculum. The email read, "You understand the intersection of memory and future in a way no one else is teaching." Frank wasn't just a participant now. He was a builder. A teacher. A bridge. Over the next few months, he split his time between his small town and the SpaceX campus in Austin, guiding older creatives through projects, offering feedback, holding storytelling salons in the evenings. One of his favorite students was Ruth, a former librarian in her late 70s who created an AI short film from the perspective of a forgotten book on a dusty shelf. The story ended with a child discovering the book again, blowing off the dust, and reading the opening line. Frank cried watching it. "That's you," Erin had said when he showed her. "You were the book." Frank nodded. "Maybe. But now I get to be the hand that finds others." His audience continued to grow. People didn't just watch him, they followed his prompts, used his templates, told their own stories. And as they did, something remarkable began to happen. The platform changed. What was once seen as an entertainment tool began to shift toward legacy building. Toward memory preservation. Toward emotional truth. Elon tweeted one day, "AI storytelling is not about spectacle. It's about depth." At Frank Tells Stories proves that every day. Frank saw the tweet during lunch. Nearly choked on his sandwich. Erin called him minutes later. "You've officially been Musked," she said. "Congratulations. You're part of the machine now." Frank just smiled. "Not the machine," he said. "The heart inside it." And he meant it. Because it wasn't just about fame or validation anymore. It was about witnessing something bigger, a generation re-entering the creative conversation. Not begging for a seat at the table, but building a new table entirely. Frank kept teaching. Kept sharing. But quietly, in the margins of his days, he began working on something private. Something personal. A project he hadn't told anyone about yet. A full-length film. Not just a short, not just a story. A true cinematic piece. His story. Margaret's story. The story of how he stopped dreaming, and what pulled him back. He called it, First Light. It opened on a man walking through a house filled with old photographs and closed doors. It ended on that same man standing in the middle of a barren field, as dawn broke over the horizon. One line of narration, he didn't know what would come next. Only that he was finally ready for it. It wasn't finished yet. But it was beginning. And for Frank, that beginning was everything. Frank woke to an early spring morning scented with dew and possibility. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, sketching delicate plates of light across his bedspread, and his phone buzzed sharply beside him. Groggy, he answered, it was Erin. She woke him up this early to remind him, the local short film festival was today, and Launch Window had been officially selected for screening. His heart banged in his chest. A festival. He exhaled a sharp laugh. A real festival. The kind where people dressed up and cameras flashed and strangers clapped at things he made. He'd never imagined that moment, not even in his wildest AI-fueled dreams. He showered quickly, dressed in his best sweater and slacks, grabbed the USB stick containing the film, just in case, and headed out. Driving through town felt different now. The same streets, the same nod from the crossing guard. But Frank saw them with new eyes. Every nod felt like a quiet recognition, someone acknowledging that he existed, that what he did mattered. At the festival venue, a humble downtown theater repurposed from an old playhouse, everyone was buzzing. Young filmmakers chatted in corners, parents wrung their hands, and projectionists made last-minute checks. Frank checked in at the desk. Launch Window, said a man with a clipboard. You're on in the second block. Patio seating opens at 6. Frank nodded, swallowed. Patio seating. They were treating this like a big deal. He placed the USB in his jacket pocket and stepped into the hallway. Sounds from the next block, laughter, applause, the hum of a projector turning on. People milled about. A teenager with dyed hair and camera gear zipped by. Did you do the rocket one? She asked, eyes bright. Frank nodded, yes. She grinned, I cried. Frank nearly burst. Cried. The word echoed in his head. He had watched his wife die without crying. He had packed her things without crying. And now, a stranger, an actual stranger, cried. Because of something he made. He walked into the theater proper, the seat warm and sticky, the air just cool enough. The opening film started rolling, a montage of campus shorts, travelogues, experimental pieces that glowed on the screen. Frank watched, heart racing, until he saw his film's title appear on a placard, Launch Window. He nearly said it out loud. On screen, Walter's story played again, but this time on the big screen, with surround sound. The pounding music, the scratch of pencil on paper, the soft hope in the old man's voice. Frank sat still, tears sharp in his eyes. People laughed where he intended them to. They cried where he intended them to. They gasped at the ending. Then there was silence. A beat. And then applause. Slow, steady, then full. He had never heard applause like this. It wasn't polite, it was real. A few people stood. The teenager from before stood, looked at him, mouthed, thank you. He nodded. The night continued, other films, other creators, but Frank watched only this one. He felt weightless, like Margaret was beside him, smiling. At the end, the festival director approached. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a clipboard. Frank, that was extraordinary. She shook his hand warmly. Would you consider hosting a talkback tomorrow? Tell the audience how you did it, how you started at 72 with AI. Frank blinked. Talkback. Him. On a stage. He swallowed. Yes. I'll try. Outside the theater, the air was cool, stars beginning to dot the sky. Erin was waiting by the entrance. She enveloped him in a hug. He felt the years fall away. "You did it," she whispered. He nodded. "We did it." The next morning, at 10, Frank stood before an audience in a smaller salon room downtown. A few older faces, but also younger ones, curious ones. He told them, plain and steady, how AI was not magic, how it was a tool in the hands of real people with hope, how he began in a recliner with nothing but regret, and pushed because the world said he was too old, and found he wasn't. Questions followed. How do you start? How do you push past self-doubt? What do you say to your past self? He answered honestly. Start with what haunts you. Doubt is proof you care. You say you're sorry to your past self by building something now. Later, over coffee, the journalist from the history department approached. Your work has depth, she said. Hollywood could learn from people like you. Frank smiled. We're not trying to compete. We're trying to remind them that life doesn't stop being cinematic at 70. She nodded like she understood, then scribbled something. He didn't ask where it would appear. He didn't need to. It didn't matter. He had stood on a stage. He had told a room full of people that, build what haunts you, and they listened. On the way home, Erin and Frank stopped for lunch. They sat in a diner that smelled of coffee and memories. She reached across the table and took his hand. I never thought you'd do this. I mean, I believed it, but I never thought you'd actually do it. Frank took a deep breath. Neither, he admitted. But I'm just starting. She squeezed his hand. Then let's finish that story, she said. And he laughed because that was exactly what he wanted. When he got home, he placed the festival program beside his laptop. He opened Neuroframe. First Light waited. He stared at the title. Then typed the next line, he walks into dawn, shadows falling behind him, and in the light, he sees himself again. He clicked Generate. The screen glowed. Colors bled, silhouette breathed. Music rose. And somewhere outside, the day began. Frank had never been much for crowds, but the film festival talkback had cracked something open. It was more than applause or compliments, it was connection. The kind of connection he hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. He woke that morning with a new sense of purpose, his mind buzzing with ideas sparked by conversations the night before. Erin was already at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, laptop open and glowing. Got a message, she said, not looking up. Frank peered over. On the screen was an email subject line that made his chest tighten, invitation from the American Storytelling Guild. He clicked it open, scanning the words, Dear Mr. Thompson, your work with Neuroframe and your recent film have inspired us. We would be honored if you could join our upcoming symposium on digital narrative innovation, and share your insights on storytelling for older generations. He blinked. The American Storytelling Guild was a respected institution. To be invited was no small thing. They want me, he said, voice cracking with disbelief. Erin smiled. They want you because you're doing what no one else is, showing that creativity has no expiration date. The idea of traveling to New York City, of speaking on a panel with younger digital artists and academics, made Frank's stomach twist. But more than fear, there was excitement. This was a chance to bring his message to a larger audience. To stand tall not as a relic but as a pioneer. Over the next few days, Frank prepared. He rewatched his videos, refined his talking points, and rehearsed with Erin. Remember, she said, they want to hear your story, not just the tech. On the plane, clouds drifting beneath him like cotton fields, Frank felt a flutter of nerves. The city skyline appeared, jagged and bright against a pale sky. He remembered the first time he came to New York, decades ago, fresh out of college, eyes full of hope. Now, he was older, yes. But that hope was alive again, sharper than ever. The symposium was held in a sleek auditorium, seats packed with eager faces, creators, scholars, industry veterans. The session was titled Narratives Reimagined, the Role of AI in Preserving Memory. When Frank took the stage, the lights dimmed, the crowd hushed. He began slowly, telling the story of Walter, the man from Launch Window, the lost dreams and rediscoveries, and how AI helped him tell a story that felt like a heartbeat. As he spoke, he watched the audience lean in, some nodding, others wiping tears. Then he showed clips from his channel, the tutorials, the viral moments, the rawness of his Frank Teaches the Internet. He ended with a simple but profound truth: we're all storytellers, no matter our age. AI is just a brush, what matters is the soul behind it. The questions came fast: how do we make technology accessible to seniors with limited tech experience? What about authenticity? How do you avoid AI making stories feel artificial? What advice would you give to people who feel they've missed their moment? Frank answered honestly: technology can be a barrier, but it can also be a bridge. Start small, be patient, and remember that your voice is unique. Authenticity comes from honesty. AI can replicate visuals and sounds, but it can't fake the heart behind a story. Missed moments aren't lost, they're waiting to be reclaimed. Every day is a new first day. After the session, several attendees approached him with enthusiasm, including a young filmmaker named Maya, whose grandmother was learning to use Neuroframe to capture family stories. "Your work is changing lives," she said, tears shining in her eyes. Frank felt overwhelmed, humbled. On the final night of the symposium, there was a gala dinner. Frank sat next to a professor specializing in gerontology and digital media. Their conversation turned to the fear many older adults felt about technology: that it was too complicated, that it rendered them invisible. That fear, the professor said, is rooted in feeling erased. But your work reminds people that they matter. That their stories matter. Frank nodded. It's more than just storytelling. It's reclaiming identity. When he returned home, the emails poured in. Requests for interviews, collaborations, speaking engagements. The world was noticing. But amidst the flurry, Frank stayed grounded. Every morning, he returned to first light, tweaking scenes, adjusting colors, layering sounds. Each frame was a meditation on time: how it slips, how it heals, how it surprises. One afternoon, Aaron burst into the room with a message from SpaceX. Elon Musk himself had tweeted about Frank's latest tutorial video, calling it an essential guide for unlocking creativity at any age. Frank stared at the screen, heart pounding. He messaged back: "Tell him thank you, and I'm just getting started." The acknowledgement fueled his resolve. He wasn't just making films or tutorials, he was part of a movement. A movement of older voices rising, refusing to be silenced. Then came a surprise call from his estranged son, Mark. "Dad, I saw your videos," Mark said hesitantly. I'm proud of you." The words hung heavy in the air, years of silence and pain compressed into that single sentence. Frank swallowed hard, eyes misting. "I'm proud of you, too," he replied. They talked for hours, tentatively at first, then more openly. Mark shared his struggles, his regrets. Frank shared his new life, his hope. It was a beginning, fragile but real. That night, Frank sat on the porch, the cool air wrapping around him. The stars above seemed to pulse with new meaning. He thought about all the moments that had led him here, the loneliness, the fear, the small acts of courage. "I was never too old," he whispered to the night. "I was just waiting for the right story to tell." And in that silence, the future shimmered, bright, uncharted, and utterly his. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank's small garage had always been a place of quiet invention, dusty memories, and the lingering scent of sawdust and motor oil. In his younger days, it was where he built model rockets, took apart old radios, and dreamed of possibilities bigger than the town that held him. But in recent years, it had become a storage closet for forgotten tools and faded plans, a place where dreams went to nap, if not die. After the festival and the symposium, something inside him stirred, a restless urge to reclaim that space, to transform it from a dusty relic into a laboratory of new beginnings. One morning, Frank pushed open the creaking garage door, sunlight streaming in to illuminate motes of dust dancing like tiny galaxies. He wiped a thick layer of grime off an old workbench and ran his hands over scattered tools. The sight of the space struck him with a strange mix of nostalgia and possibility. This place, quiet and humble, could become the heart of his next chapter. With renewed energy, Frank cleared the clutter, sweeping years of neglect into piles. He arranged his laptop and monitors on the old bench, set up cameras and lights he had bought on a whim, and connected his AI platform, Neuroframe. The garage wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was becoming a studio, a classroom, a creative sanctuary. Aaron dropped by one afternoon, smiling at the transformation. "Looks like you're building more than just films here." Frank chuckled. "Maybe I'm building a bridge. The bridge between past and future, between memory and creation." He began inviting others to join him, older neighbors, friends, even young tech enthusiasts who admired his work. The garage buzzed with conversations about storytelling, technology, and the courage to start again. They called it the Garage Reimagined. One afternoon, Ruth, the librarian turned filmmaker, brought her project, a short film narrated by an AI-generated voiceover of a long-lost letter. Together, they explored ways to layer emotion into the digital voice, tweaking intonation and pacing until it sounded less machine, more human heart. Watching Ruth's eyes light up when her film came alive reminded Frank of the power in these moments, not just creation, but connection. Frank also experimented, mixing scenes from First Light with new AI-generated backgrounds, a sunrise over a familiar field, a broken fence repaired in the golden light. He learned to coax the AI to understand metaphor, emotion, imperfection. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The garage became a hub for weekend workshops, where older adults who'd never touched a camera or computer found themselves telling stories they thought had died with them. There was Gloria, who shared stories of her childhood during the Great Depression. There was James, a retired firefighter who created a documentary about his unit's last call. Slowly, the community grew. The local newspaper ran a feature titled "The Garage Where Stories Come Back to Life." The attention brought more visitors, more ideas, and a surprising invitation, a grant from a foundation dedicated to senior innovation. With the funds, Frank upgraded equipment and started a scholarship program for older creators with financial barriers. Each grant recipient got a setup like his own: laptop, software access, basic training, and a place to share their work online. One evening, as Frank locked up the garage, his phone buzzed with a video message from Elon Musk himself. Elon's voice was calm but enthusiastic. "Frank, your work is redefining what it means to be creative later in life. I'm sending a prototype for a new AI storytelling tool we're developing. It's more intuitive, adaptive. I want you to be one of the first to test it." Frank stared at the message, heart pounding. The man who had sparked his journey was still lighting the way, pushing boundaries, inviting Frank to push his own. The garage suddenly felt less like an old shed and more like a launch pad. Frank dove into the new tool, fascinated by how it could learn from his feedback, suggest emotional beats, and even improvise dialogue. It was as if the AI itself had personality, quirky, thoughtful, willing to experiment. He created a short vignette using the new tool, a scene where an older man and his estranged daughter reconnect through a shared story of loss and hope. When he shared the clip online, the response was immediate and profound. Comments flooded in, "This brought me to tears. Finally, something that speaks to my life. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late." One message stood out. It was from Mark, his son, writing simply, "Dad, I watched it 3 times. I'm ready to talk. Frank felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Technology had brought him his son back, but more importantly, it had brought him hope. That night, in the quiet of his reimagined garage, Frank whispered, "This is just the beginning." The transformation wasn't just about tools or films, it was about reclaiming identity, embracing change, and lighting the way for others. He realized that Elon's example wasn't just a spark to ignite action, it was a lesson in fearless evolution. Age wasn't a cage. It was a lens, one that revealed a richer, deeper view of the world. The garage was no longer a place where dreams went to sleep. It was where they learned to fly again. And Frank was ready to soar. Frank woke before dawn, the gentle hum of the city still sleeping beneath the dim glow of streetlights. The garage window framed a sky painted with streaks of lavender and gold, the promise of another day unfolding. Despite the late hour, his mind raced. Today was the day he would meet Mark in person after years of silence, a meeting made possible by the unexpected bridge technology had built between them. The weight of anticipation sat heavily on his chest, mingled with a fragile thread of hope. Memories flooded back, harsh words, missed birthdays, long nights spent wondering if reconciliation was ever possible. But Frank had learned that stories, like people, needed time to unfold and be heard. He dressed carefully, choosing a simple shirt and jacket, items Mark had once complimented long ago. Erin packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, her silent support steadying him. The cafe where they'd agreed to meet was quiet, tucked away in a tree-lined corner of town, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the crisp morning air. Frank arrived early, his palms slightly clammy, and chose a table by the window. Minutes stretched into an eternity until the door opened and Mark stepped inside. Time seemed to slow. Mark looked older, yes, but something had shifted, an openness in his eyes, a softened jawline, a tentative smile. Frank rose, and they embraced awkwardly at first, the years of silence a fragile barrier melting away with the touch. "Dad," Mark said, voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you." "You too," Frank replied, swallowing a lump. They sat, coffee steaming between them, and the conversation began haltingly, circling memories, apologies, and small confessions. Frank shared how the festival and symposium had changed him, how AI had given him a new voice and a new family in the creative community. Mark listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes wiping his eyes. "I saw your videos," Mark admitted. "I was ashamed I wasn't part of that, part of you." Frank reached across the table, placing a hand on Mark's. "It's never too late. We can write new chapters." Mark smiled, the tension easing. "I want to try." As the morning light warmed the cafe, they talked about shared passions and new dreams. Mark, a software developer, was fascinated by Frank's use of AI. "I want to help you build something bigger," he said, "something that can connect stories across generations." The idea ignited a spark. Together, they brainstormed, a digital archive where seniors could upload memories, photos, and videos, with AI helping weave them into narratives accessible to their families and communities. A legacy platform, Frank mused. Not just preserving the past but inspiring the future. The conversation flowed effortlessly, a river breaking through a dam of years apart. Outside, the city pulsed with life, children playing, cars passing, birds beginning their morning songs, but inside the cafe, a fragile new world was being built. Over the next weeks, father and son worked side by side, blending Frank's storytelling vision with Mark's coding expertise. The project, called Echoes, began to take shape, a website and app where users could create AI-assisted videos, memoirs, and interactive stories. They held workshops in the garage, inviting locals to test Echoes and share feedback. Older adults marveled at the ability to see their childhood homes reconstructed in 3D, to hear AI-generated voices read letters from their youth, to preserve traditions in ways they'd never imagined. Frank watched as the community transformed, fear and hesitation giving way to curiosity and pride. The project drew attention from media outlets and philanthropic groups eager to support intergenerational storytelling. One afternoon, Aaron handed Frank a letter from a foundation offering a substantial grant to expand echoes nationwide. The possibilities stretched before them like a vast horizon. Yet, despite the momentum, Frank faced moments of doubt. The weight of technology's pace, the lingering fear of failure, and the deep scars of past regrets sometimes clouded his vision. On quiet nights, he questioned whether he could keep up with the new world or whether age was an unyielding barrier after all. But Elon Musk's words echoed in his mind: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank realized that his battle wasn't against time or age, it was against the stories he told himself about his limits. He was rewriting not just films, but his own narrative. One evening, as Frank prepared for a presentation on echoes at a technology conference, a surprise video message arrived from Elon Musk. Elon's face appeared, his voice steady and encouraging: "Frank, your work is more than innovation. It's inspiration. Keep pushing the boundaries. The future belongs to those who refuse to be defined by age or convention." The message sent a surge of energy through Frank's veins. At the conference, standing before an audience of tech innovators and storytellers, Frank spoke not just of AI or code, but of human resilience and connection. He shared the story of Launch Window, the birth of Echoes, and the reunion with his son. He urged everyone to embrace change fearlessly, to see technology as a tool for empowerment, not exclusion. The room erupted in applause, some standing. Afterwards, a young woman approached, tears shining. "You've given me hope. My grandmother is isolated and afraid of tech. But your story shows it's possible." Frank smiled, feeling the circle widen. Returning home, the garage buzzed with activity: volunteers, new users, local news crews. Frank caught himself smiling often, heart lighter than it had been in years. He realized that connection was the true power of his work, the bridge across silence, loneliness, and fear. One late night, alone in the garage, Frank opened the Echoes platform and navigated through stories shared by users: a World War II veteran's recollections, a quiltmaker's oral history, a daughter's tribute to her mother's recipes. Each story was a testament to lives lived fully, rich with triumph and sorrow. Frank understood then that his journey was part of something larger, a movement to ensure no story was lost to time, no voice silenced by age. His own story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe that creativity and connection could defy any limit. He closed his eyes and whispered, "This is what it means to be alive." And with that, the past and future converged, creating a legacy not bound by years, but by heart. The summer heat pressed softly against the windowpanes of Frank's garage studio, the golden afternoon light filtering through dust motes like whispered promises. Frank sat in his worn leather chair, staring at his latest video draft on the screen, fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. The room felt charged, not with doubt, but anticipation. He'd come so far from the man who once believed creativity was a young person's game, yet deep inside, an old voice still whispered, "Who do you think you are? Who's watching?" For years, that voice had kept him tethered to silence and solitude. But today, something was different. After months of working with Elon's AI tools, reconnecting with his son, launching Echoes, and sharing stories of his generation, Frank understood one crucial truth: the most powerful barrier to transformation isn't technology, it's permission. Permission we give ourselves to matter, to create, to change. Aaron had left for the day, and Frank leaned back, eyes closing briefly. "I was never too old," he whispered into the quiet, "I just didn't know I had permission." The memory of Elon Musk's words echoed: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Permission wasn't granted by others, nor was it bound by age or circumstance. It came from within. That evening, Frank called a meeting with the core team behind Echoes. The group was a motley mix of older creators, tech volunteers, and young storytellers inspired by Frank's journey. In the warm glow of the garage, amidst cables and cameras, Frank spoke openly. We've built a platform, yes, but it's more than that. We're building a community where people give themselves permission to tell their stories. To matter. To be heard. The room hummed with agreement. Ruth, the librarian filmmaker, raised a question: how do we reach those who feel invisible, those who think their stories aren't worth telling? Frank smiled. By meeting them where they are, and reminding them that every life is a narrative rich with meaning. It's not about perfect production. It's about truth. Inspired, the team launched permission workshops, outreach programs in nursing homes, community centers, and libraries. They brought simple tech kits, easy tutorials, and most importantly, encouragement. At a local senior center, Frank watched Gloria, once hesitant and fearful of the camera, beam as she recorded a story about her childhood garden. I never thought I'd be a filmmaker, she said, eyes bright with tears. But here I am. The workshop spread like wildfire. Word of mouth brought more participants, many skeptical at first but soon transformed by the experience of being seen and heard. Frank's phone buzzed constantly, messages of gratitude, videos of rediscovered joy, stories reclaimed. One message stood apart, from a woman named Linda in Ohio. Your story gave me permission to start painting again after 40 years. Thank you. Frank felt tears well as he replied, keep creating. The world needs your light. Amidst this growth, challenges remained. The digital divide was real, and many older adults struggled with accessibility or skepticism. Frank worked with Mark to simplify Echo's interface, adding voice commands and AI-guided prompts. They also launched a mentorship program pairing tech-savvy youth with seniors, bridging not only generational gaps but fears and misunderstandings. Frank marveled at the bonds forming, young and old learning from each other, sharing laughter and stories, discovering new ways to connect. One chilly autumn morning, Frank received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national aging conference in Washington, D.C. Standing at the podium in front of policymakers and advocates, he told his story, not just of AI or filmmaking, but of the power of permission. When we give ourselves permission to matter, we unlock creativity, purpose, and hope, he said, voice steady. Age is not an obstacle, but a strength, a lens through which we see the richness of life. His words resonated. A senator approached afterward, proposing a pilot program integrating echoes into senior services nationwide. Frank realized that what began as a personal journey was influencing policy and culture. Back home, Aaron prepared a surprise for Frank, a montage of Echo's users sharing what permission to create had meant to them. As Frank watched, a deep sense of fulfillment settled over him. He thought of Elon's example, not just in innovation, but in daring to challenge norms and expectations. Frank knew the real revolution was not technology, but the human spirit refusing to be boxed by age, fear, or silence. Late that night, alone in the garage, Frank turned off the lights and stepped outside. The stars were bright, vast and eternal. He whispered into the night, permission granted. Permission given. Permission lived. And in that moment, the future was wide open, not just for Frank, but for all who dared to believe that it's never too late to start, to create, and to matter. Frank was no stranger to quiet moments in his garage studio, but today the air felt different, charged with a subtle electricity that stirred his nerves and excitement in equal measure. After months of hard work, the latest Echoes project was finally ready for public release, a deeply personal anthology of stories told by older adults across the country, woven together by AI to create a tapestry of shared experience, resilience, and hope. He stared at the Publish button, hesitating briefly, then clicked. Instantly, the website and app went live. For a few hours, there was nothing but the soft hum of his computer fans and the ticking of the wall clock. Frank wondered if anyone would notice, if the voices and stories would reach beyond the familiar walls of the garage and his local community. Then, notifications began flooding in, views, shares, comments, messages. People were watching. They were listening. A comment from a woman named Martha caught Frank's eye. "This made me cry. My mother told me stories like these, but I never recorded them. Thank you for reminding me what matters." Another from a man named Joe read, "Finally, a place where I see myself. Age isn't a limit, it's a story waiting to be told." The impact was immediate and profound. But what surprised Frank most was who was responding, not only older adults, but younger generations, children, grandchildren, educators, even strangers from across the globe, drawn in by the raw honesty and beauty of the stories. The anthology was bridging divides Frank hadn't fully imagined. Schools began incorporating Echo's stories into history and literature classes, sparking intergenerational conversations and projects. A high school teacher in Ohio wrote, "My students have never been more engaged. They see their grandparents in a new light." A social worker shared how the platform helped isolated seniors feel connected during the pandemic's long shadow. Media outlets picked up the story, calling Echoes a groundbreaking tool that reshaped how society viewed aging and legacy. Frank's phone rang off the hook with interview requests and invitations to speak worldwide. But amidst the whirlwind, Frank stayed grounded, remembering why he started. To give permission to create and connect. One evening, as he reviewed messages, an email from a Hollywood producer landed in his inbox. The subject line read, "Invitation, collaborate on a new project inspired by Echoes." Frank felt a thrill. Hollywood, a world he once viewed as distant and inaccessible, was reaching out. The producer, a woman named Lisa, wrote of her interest in creating a feature film based on Echoes stories, blending AI-generated visuals with live storytelling to capture the depth of human experience. She saw potential for a groundbreaking fusion of technology and heart, something Hollywood had struggled to do authentically. Frank agreed to meet Lisa, and soon they were brainstorming in the garage, the space now filled with creative energy and eager anticipation. Lisa's vision was bold, a cinematic experience where audience members could interact with AI-driven narratives, choosing which stories to explore, shaping the emotional journey. Frank saw echoes of Elon Musk's radical thinking in her ideas, the refusal to settle for the old ways, the embrace of the unknown. They worked tirelessly, blending Frank's storytelling with Lisa's industry know-how and the cutting-edge AI tools Frank had developed. The project grew, a testament to what was possible when generations, technologies, and dreams converged. Meanwhile, Frank continued to nurture the community around Echoes. He held virtual gatherings where users shared their stories live, their faces glowing with pride and vulnerability. The platform's forums buzzed with encouragement, advice, and friendship. One night, after a particularly moving session, Frank received a private message from a woman named Helen, whose story about surviving polio had deeply moved the group. "You've given me courage to share more," she wrote. "I never thought my story mattered until now." Frank replied simply, "Your story matters. Always." These moments, small yet powerful, reminded Frank that transformation wasn't about fame or recognition, but about human connection and the courage to be seen. As the Hollywood collaboration progressed, Frank found himself reflecting on his journey, the boy who once feared he was too old, the man who found Elon Musk's spark and dared to change, the creator who built a community from silence and doubt. He realized the unexpected audience he had touched, the young and old, near and far, was the true reward. One afternoon, Mark joined him in the garage, holding a tablet displaying the latest AI-enhanced scenes from the film project. "Dad," Mark said, eyes shining, "this is bigger than I imagined. We're not just telling stories. We're changing how the world sees aging." Frank smiled, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. "It's about time," he said softly, "that every voice has a place to be heard." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and promise. Inside the garage, a new chapter was unfolding, a story of hope, innovation, and the enduring power of human stories to bridge divides and inspire change. Frank knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt truly ready to face whatever came next. Frank sat quietly in the softly lit room of the innovation lab, the hum of servers surrounding him like a gentle pulse. Around him, engineers and artists worked side by side, crafting the very heart of the AI that powered Echo's storytelling magic. He traced his fingers lightly over the smooth surface of the console, marveling at how far this journey had taken him, from hesitant storyteller to a pioneer standing at the crossroads of humanity and technology. It wasn't just about the code or the machines. It was about the soul woven into every narrative, every frame, every whispered memory. This was Elon Musk's influence at its finest, not the man himself, but his relentless drive to break limits, to challenge what's possible. The AI wasn't just generating videos, it was learning the nuances of human emotion, capturing the subtle flickers of joy and pain, hope and regret. Frank remembered when he first met the AI team, young, passionate, brimming with ideas but unsure how to capture the depth of the stories Echoes collected. "We need the heart of the machine to beat with real feeling," Frank had told them. They listened. They experimented. They built algorithms that could recognize tone, pace, even cultural context, so that every story felt authentic, resonant, and alive. One evening, Frank watched as the AI transformed a simple audio recording of an elderly woman's voice into a vivid, immersive video, the sun setting behind a farmhouse, the smell of fresh bread baking, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was more than technology, it was memory made real. Tears welled in Frank's eyes. For the first time, he understood that the heart of the machine was the human spirit itself. But the journey wasn't without obstacles. Skeptics questioned whether AI could truly capture the soul, fearing it might replace genuine human connection with synthetic emotion. Others worried about privacy, about the power of technology in the hands of the vulnerable. Frank addressed these concerns openly, advocating for ethical design and transparency. He insisted that Echoes remain a tool to empower, not erase, the storyteller's voice. "The AI is a brush," he said during a panel discussion, "but the story belongs to the person who paints it." One afternoon, as Frank reviewed user feedback, a message caught his attention, a letter from a man named Walter, a retired firefighter who had lost his hearing. Walter explained how Echo's AI-generated sign language translations had allowed him to connect with his grandchildren in ways he never thought possible. "You've given me a voice again," Walter wrote. Frank felt a surge of gratitude and purpose. This was why he persevered. The next phase of development focused on accessibility, integrating voice recognition, sign language interpretation, and multilanguage support. Mark threw himself into the work, his youthful energy complementing Frank's seasoned insight. Their partnership, once tentative, had blossomed into a seamless collaboration, each learning from the other. Late nights in the lab often turned into deep conversations about legacy, family, and the meaning of time. "Dad," Mark said one evening, "I used to think your stories were just nostalgia. Now I see they're the future." Frank smiled, feeling a warmth that transcended words. Meanwhile, the Hollywood project advanced, blending AI artistry with real-life narratives. Lisa, the producer, pushed boundaries, experimenting with virtual reality experiences where viewers could step inside memories, walk through a grandmother's kitchen, or hear a grandfather's voice recounting a childhood adventure. The fusion of technology and emotion was breathtaking, sometimes overwhelming. Frank marveled at how Elon Musk's vision of harnessing innovation for humanity's benefit played out in ways he had never imagined. Yet, amidst the triumphs, Frank never lost sight of the personal stories, the man who finally told his daughter about his service in Vietnam, the woman who captured her journey through breast cancer, the couple who shared decades of love and loss. Each story was a thread in a vast tapestry of human experience. One day, Frank received a surprise visit from a group of high school students eager to learn about Echoes. Their curiosity was infectious, their questions thoughtful and earnest. They asked about AI, storytelling, and the courage to change late in life. Frank shared his journey, from self-doubt to empowerment, reminding them that every generation has the power to redefine what's possible. As the sun set behind the city skyline, Frank stood on the rooftop of the Innovation Lab, gazing out at the sprawling world below. He thought about Elon Musk's words, how fearlessness and radical thinking could ignite transformation at any age. He realized that the heart of the machine was not just technology or innovation, it was courage. The courage to tell one's story, to embrace change, to connect across divides. In that moment, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. He was not just an old man with a camera in a garage. He was part of a movement, a living testament to the power of permission, technology, and the enduring human spirit. The future was bright, not because machines would replace us, but because they would help us see ourselves more clearly. Frank whispered into the cool night air, "This is only the beginning." Frank felt the unmistakable tremor in his chest as he gazed out over the sprawling city from the rooftop of the Innovation Lab. The horizon stretched wide, a canvas of possibility tinged with the deep oranges and purples of sunset. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe in the vastness of it all, the years behind him, the uncertain years ahead, the countless stories waiting to be told. At 68, Frank knew he was standing at a kind of edge, the precipice between what had been and what could still be. The journey that began with a flicker of doubt in his small garage had exploded into a movement, uniting generations through stories rendered vivid by AI's magic. But with growth came new challenges, questions about sustainability, impact, and the very meaning of legacy. One evening, after a long day of meetings and code reviews, Frank sat alone in the quiet of his home office. He opened a letter from a woman named Evelyn, a 72-year-old artist from Montana who had recently discovered echoes through a local workshop. "Your work has given me a second chance," she wrote. "I thought my time to create was over, but I found new fire in your stories. Thank you for reminding me that age is not the end." Tears blurred Frank's vision as he reread her words. He thought of his own regrets, the years he'd spent silent, the missed connections, the moments lost to fear and uncertainty. But Evelyn's letter was proof that the flame could still be rekindled. The next morning, Frank and Mark met with Lisa and the production team to discuss the upcoming phase of their Hollywood collaboration. They planned a nationwide tour of immersive storytelling experiences, bringing AI-generated narratives directly to communities, libraries, senior centers, schools, even hospitals. The goal was clear: to reach those who felt forgotten, invisible, or too old to change. "This is about more than technology," Frank said, his voice steady. "It's about hope." As preparations began, Frank found himself reflecting on Elon Musk's relentless drive to push boundaries, to test limits that others accepted as fixed. Elon's refusal to accept the status quo had inspired Frank to challenge his own assumptions about aging, creativity, and purpose. But Frank also recognized that not everyone had the privilege or courage to take that leap. He thought about his estranged brother, Tom, who still believed Frank was chasing a fool's dream. Their last conversation, years ago, had ended in silence and hurt. Frank felt the old ache of regret but also a newfound resolve. He picked up the phone and dialed Tom's number. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Frank? Is that you?" The conversation was tentative at first, but as Frank shared his journey, Tom's walls began to crumble. "Maybe I've been too hard on you," Tom admitted. "I guess I didn't understand." They agreed to meet, and over coffee a few days later, Frank saw the brother he'd missed for so long, the man who needed permission to hope, just like him. The reunion was messy, honest, and healing. Meanwhile, the Echoes team worked tirelessly, balancing innovation with compassion. They incorporated feedback from users, making the AI more intuitive and respectful of diverse cultures and experiences. The mentorship program blossomed, connecting seniors with volunteers eager to learn from and support them. Frank watched as communities lit up with creativity, laughter, and connection. Yet, as the tour launch approached, doubts crept in. Could this movement withstand the pressures of scale and scrutiny? Would the stories lose their authenticity amid growing demand? One night, Frank confided in Aaron. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just a man chasing shadows," he said. Aaron squeezed his hand gently. "You're more than that, Dad. You're a beacon. On opening night of the tour, in a bustling community center in Detroit, Frank stood before a diverse crowd of all ages. The room pulsed with anticipation as the AI-generated stories played, each frame rich with emotion and history. A hush fell over the audience. When the lights rose, applause erupted, spontaneous, heartfelt. Tears glistened in many eyes. A young woman approached Frank afterward, her grandmother's voice echoing in her ears. "Thank you for showing me my roots," she whispered. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded, people moved to tears, laughter, and reflection. Social media buzzed with shared experiences, sparking conversations about aging, memory, and hope. Frank realized that the edge he'd feared was not a cliff but a gateway, an invitation to leap into something greater. The movement was no longer his alone, it belonged to the countless voices now lifted and heard. One afternoon, as Frank walked through a park near his home, he spotted a group of children gathered around an elderly man telling stories. The man's eyes sparkled with life, his voice steady and sure. Frank approached, and the man smiled warmly. "I'm Walter," he said, "and thanks to echoes, I've found my voice again." Frank felt the familiar surge of gratitude and purpose. This was why he dared to change. As twilight settled, Frank looked up at the stars once more, whispering a silent thank you to the spark that had ignited this journey. He knew the path ahead would still hold uncertainty and struggle, but now he faced it with courage, community, and the unwavering belief that it's never too late to start again. Frank had always known that meaningful change came with growing pains, but nothing prepared him for the storm brewing on the horizon. The Echoes Project, which had become a beacon for aging voices and a symbol of hope, was now under scrutiny from unexpected quarters. One morning, as Frank sifted through his emails in the quiet of his home office, a message flagged urgent caught his eye. It was from the legal team advising on the Hollywood collaboration. The letter detailed concerns raised by a coalition of privacy advocates and AI ethicists. They questioned the extent to which Echoes AI could represent real human emotion without exploitation. "Are we commodifying memories?" one article headline screamed online. The backlash hit social media like wildfire. Some critics accused Frank of using vulnerable elders for technology's sake, calling the project invasive or manipulative. Others feared AI would replace real human storytellers, eroding authentic connection. The voices of skepticism echoed the very fears Frank had fought to overcome within himself. He felt the sting of public doubt but refused to let it dismantle everything built with love and sweat. Yet, the reckoning was more than a PR crisis. It was a moment of deep reflection. Frank gathered his closest collaborators, including Mark, Aaron, and Lisa, for an emergency meeting in the garage studio that had sparked it all. The room was heavy with tension and uncertainty. "We built this to give people power, not take it away," Frank said quietly. "We need to listen carefully." The conversation turned raw and honest. Lisa, the Hollywood producer, shared how the pressure to commercialize threatened to dilute the story's integrity. Mark pointed out flaws in the AI's emotional algorithms that might unintentionally misrepresent nuance. Aaron spoke passionately about the need for transparency and consent, ensuring every participant truly understood how their stories would be used. Together, they crafted a plan to address concerns head-on, a renewed commitment to ethics, user control, and community oversight. Frank reached out directly to critics, inviting dialogue rather than confrontation. He participated in panel discussions, openly acknowledging Echo's imperfections and the lessons still to be learned. Slowly, trust began to rebuild. Frank also revisited his own motivations, digging deeper into what this project meant to him and the wider world. One afternoon, while reviewing messages, a note from a woman named Gloria caught his eye. She described how Echoes helped her reconcile with her estranged son before she passed, a gift beyond measure. "This is why I keep going," Frank whispered, tears blurring his vision. Meanwhile, the Hollywood project paused temporarily, allowing time to refocus on authenticity and user empowerment. Lisa spearheaded workshops with elders and communities, co-creating content and policies to protect dignity and agency. The experience transformed the team's approach. They embraced humility, recognizing that technology must serve humanity, not the other way around. As the months passed, Frank noticed a shift in himself too. The reckoning had peeled away layers of ego and certainty, revealing a deeper, more grounded purpose. He found solace in small moments, calls with Evelyn the artist, virtual chats with Walter the firefighter, and late-night talks with Mark. They reminded him that change is messy but worthwhile. One evening, Frank stood outside the garage, feeling the cool night air brush his face. He looked up at the stars, thinking of Elon Musk's daring ventures into the unknown. The path was never smooth for those who dared to innovate, but the rewards lay in resilience and heart. Frank whispered into the darkness, "We will get it right. Together." And with that, he turned back inside, ready to continue the journey, with eyes wide open and spirit unbreakable. Frank stood at the threshold of the community center, watching as the crowd gathered to experience the latest iteration of Echo's storytelling tour. The room was alive with an energy that transcended age, culture, and background, young children clasping the hands of their grandparents, teenagers listening intently to stories from a generation they'd often overlooked, and elders sharing smiles filled with memories rekindled. It was a bridge between worlds, a living testament to the power of connection. Years ago, Frank had doubted whether his vision could touch so many hearts. Now, standing amidst this vibrant tapestry of humanity, he felt the full weight of what had been accomplished, and the promise of what still lay ahead. As the AI-driven narratives unfolded on the screens, blending visuals, sound, and interactivity, Frank noticed something profound. People were not just passive spectators, they were participants in a shared journey. Conversations sparked across tables, tears mingled with laughter, and hands reached out to comfort or celebrate. He remembered Elon Musk's mantra of pushing beyond comfort zones, of daring to create change even when the outcome was uncertain. This event embodied that courage. After the presentations, Frank moved through the crowd, greeting faces both familiar and new. A young teacher named Jasmine approached him, eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Frank, your project changed how I teach history. My students now see elders as living libraries, not just footnotes." Her words filled him with hope that the old stories could find new life and relevance. Nearby, an elderly man named George shared how echoes helped him reconnect with his son, bridging a decades-long silence. "For the first time, we truly understand each other," George said softly. Frank's heart swelled with gratitude. The bridge they'd built was more than technology, it was empathy made tangible. Yet, as he mingled, Frank felt the subtle undercurrent of tension, the reminder that despite progress, divides remained. He overheard whispers about isolation, ageism, and the relentless pace of change that left many behind. The bridge was strong, but the gaps were wide. That night, back in his garage, Frank pondered how to widen the span, to make the crossing accessible to all. Mark joined him, sharing ideas sparked from his work with virtual reality. What if we create personalized journeys, where people can walk through their own memories or those of others, feeling truly seen? Frank nodded slowly. It's not just about storytelling anymore. It's about immersion, understanding, and healing. They dove into development with renewed vigor, blending cutting-edge VR with AI to craft deeply personal experiences. The technology allowed users to explore environments that evoked forgotten emotions, reconnecting with their past and present in ways words alone could not convey. Meanwhile, Frank continued outreach efforts, collaborating with community leaders and advocacy groups to ensure inclusivity and respect. The project evolved into a platform where stories could be shared across languages, cultures, and abilities, an unprecedented mosaic of human experience. One afternoon, Frank received a call from Helen, a woman whose polio survival story had once moved him deeply. She invited him to a gathering of survivors and their families. A group eager to document and share their history before it faded. Attending the event, Frank was struck by the resilience etched into every face, the strength born of survival and love. The AI captured their stories with sensitivity, transforming memories into living art. It was moments like these that reminded Frank why he had embarked on this path, why Elon Musk's fearlessness had lit his way. Change was not a destination but a continuous bridge built by countless hands. As months passed, echoes expanded beyond U.S. borders, touching lives across continents. Frank marveled at how universal the desire to be heard and remembered was, transcending culture and time. Each story added a new thread to the global fabric of connection. Yet, despite success, Frank never lost sight of the personal. One evening, Erin found him in the garage, looking weary yet determined. "Dad, you've built something incredible," she said. "But remember to take care of yourself, too." Frank smiled gently. "I'm learning. The journey is as much about healing as it is about creating." As he closed his eyes that night, Frank reflected on the bridge they had built, from isolation to connection, from fear to hope, from fading to flourishing. It was a bridge he hoped would stand for generations to come, a testament to the power of stories, technology, and above all, the human spirit. The next morning, he rose ready to cross new horizons, knowing that with courage and heart, even the widest divides could be spanned. Frank sat in the quiet of his garage late at night, the soft glow of the computer screen reflecting in his eyes as he reviewed the latest user stories streaming in from across the country. Each video was a vivid mosaic of lives lived, laughter and tears, triumphs and losses. All woven together by the AI's delicate touch. It struck him again, none of this would be possible without the spark of courage to start, the permission to change. For decades, Frank had felt boxed in by his age, by society's whispered doubts that his best years were behind him. But echoes had become his rebellion against that narrative, a living proof that it was never too late to dream, to create, to connect. He remembered the moment years ago when Elon Musk's fearless spirit had pierced through his self-doubt like a comet across a dark sky. Elon's boldness wasn't about reckless risk, but about refusing to accept limitations others took for granted, including the limits of age. That night, Frank opened a message from an elderly woman named Maria. She had always wanted to paint but thought her hands too shaky, her time too short. Echoes had encouraged her to tell her story through digital art, blending her memories with AI-enhanced visuals. "For the first time in my life," Maria wrote, "I feel I am flying." Frank's throat tightened. The permission to soar, that was the gift Echoes gave. The next morning, Frank met with Mark and Erin to discuss the next phase, launching a mentorship initiative pairing young creatives with seniors, building bridges between generations. The goal was to foster mutual learning and dismantle stereotypes, to show that innovation and wisdom could thrive hand in hand. "It's about breaking down walls," Erin said passionately. "And giving each other permission to be more." They designed workshops where stories could be crafted collaboratively, blending youth's tech savvy with elders' lived experience. Frank found joy in watching relationships blossom, seeing once isolated seniors find new purpose and young people gain respect for history's depth. One afternoon, Frank received an unexpected call from a local high school principal named Diane. She invited him to speak about echoes and the power of reinvention. Standing before a sea of eager faces, Frank shared his journey, the fears, the doubts, the breakthroughs. He urged them not to let anyone, especially themselves, define their limits. The room hummed with energy as students asked questions, shared dreams, and talked about their own challenges. Frank left the school feeling a renewed sense of mission. The permission to soar was contagious. Meanwhile, the Hollywood team crafted a new series of AI-driven stories spotlighting everyday heroes. People overcoming adversity, aging with grace, and finding joy in unexpected places. Lisa worked closely with Frank to ensure the narratives remained authentic and empowering, pushing back against clichés and stereotypes. One story featured Ruth, a 75-year-old former pilot who had taken up skydiving to conquer her fears. As the AI brought Ruth's experience to life, viewers felt the rush of wind, the pounding heart, and the fierce determination that transcended age. The series resonated deeply, inspiring conversations across social media and in living rooms nationwide. Frank found himself overwhelmed with gratitude for the lives touched and transformed. Yet, even amid the success, he remained grounded. He knew the permission to soar wasn't a one-time event but an ongoing invitation to embrace change, to push boundaries, and to rewrite the stories we tell ourselves about aging and worth. Late one evening, Frank and Mark sat together on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer air. "Dad," Mark said softly, "you've taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway." Frank smiled, the weight of years lifting. "Exactly." As the fireflies flickered and night deepened, Frank felt a profound peace settle over him. He was no longer waiting for permission, he was granting it to himself and others, lighting a path where none existed before. Echoes was more than technology, it was a movement, a revolution of the heart, a declaration that life's best chapters could still be written. And in that truth, Frank found his legacy, not just in stories preserved, but in lives set free to soar. Frank sat alone in his study, the dim light casting long shadows over the walls lined with photographs and letters from people whose lives echoes had touched. Outside, the night hummed with quiet stillness, a stark contrast to the storm of emotion swirling within him. For years, Frank had chased a dream that many had told him was impossible, too late to change, too old to matter. Yet now, as he reflected on the journey, he realized the true impact of his work wasn't just in the stories created or the technology developed, but in the invisible ripples spreading quietly through the lives of others. An email from a man named Peter appeared on the screen, a veteran who had lost touch with his daughter after years of silence. Through echoes, Peter had recorded his memories, hopes, and regrets, sending them in a virtual message to his daughter. The response had come weeks later, a heartfelt letter of forgiveness and a promise to rebuild their relationship. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat. These unseen reconnections, these bridges mended quietly in the background, were the real victories. The next day, Frank traveled to a small town in Ohio where a community center hosted an Echoes storytelling workshop. He watched as elders gathered, sharing memories with local youths who listened with rapt attention. One woman, Ruth, spoke of her late husband's love for jazz, and how the AI had helped her create a video that captured his spirit in a way words alone never could. Tears glistened in the eyes of those listening. It was a sacred moment, proof that memories, even fragile and fading, could be preserved and honored. After the session, Frank sat down with Ruth, who smiled warmly and said, "You've given me back a piece of my heart I thought was lost forever." Frank felt a swell of emotion he couldn't put into words. Later that evening, Frank received a call from a hospital chaplain who described how Echoes was being used to comfort patients facing end-of-life moments. Families could share stories and create digital legacies that eased the weight of goodbye. Frank thought of his own parents, long gone, and how he wished he'd had this technology to hold them close just a little longer. These stories were often unseen, unheard by the world, yet they carried profound meaning. Frank realized the power of Echoes was not just in the viral successes or media coverage, but in the quiet, intimate spaces where healing and hope took root. As the sun set, Frank walked through a nearby park, the golden light filtering through the trees like a blessing. He remembered Elon Musk's fearless ventures into uncharted territory, the rockets launched, the risks taken, not for fame, but to expand humanity's reach and potential. Echoes was his own kind of voyage, a mission to expand human connection and the meaning of legacy. The next morning, Frank convened the team, sharing the stories he'd gathered. "These are the moments that matter," he said. "The ones we can't always see but that make all the difference." They decided to build a new feature into the platform, one that highlighted these intimate stories and honored the invisible impact. As the project moved forward, Frank felt a deepening sense of purpose. He had begun this journey seeking to rewrite his own narrative, but in doing so, he was helping countless others rewrite theirs. And that, he knew, was the greatest story of all. Frank stood in the middle of the bustling community hall, the familiar hum of voices mingling with the soft glow of projected images filling the space like a living tapestry of human experience. Around him, elders and young people shared stories, laughter, and tears, their faces illuminated not just by the screens but by a shared understanding that transcended generations. It was a moment that seemed to hold all the weight of the journey, the struggles, the doubts, the breakthroughs, and the promise of something greater still unfolding. Years ago, Frank had felt invisible, as if his story no longer mattered in a world rushing forward without him. But now, standing here surrounded by so many lives touched by echoes, he realized that invisibility was a myth, a story we tell ourselves when we forget the power we hold to change, to connect, to matter. The journey had not been easy. There were moments of fear and uncertainty, setbacks and criticism, times when the weight of age and loss threatened to extinguish the fire within. Yet, through it all, a spark remained, a spark lit by a figure who had dared to challenge limits and rewrite the rules, Elon Musk. Frank remembered Elon's words, echoing in his mind like a call to arms: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Those words had become a mantra, a guiding light in the darkest hours. The technology that once seemed like a distant dream had blossomed into a living, breathing movement, a platform where stories once buried in silence now soared across the world. Frank watched as a young woman shared a video about her grandmother's journey through the Great Depression, the AI blending archival footage with personal memories in a seamless dance of past and present. Nearby, an elderly man wept quietly as he listened to a message from his late wife, brought to life with such authenticity that the room felt sacred. Frank's own story had become a thread in this grand tapestry, no longer just his own but part of a collective legacy that honored resilience, hope, and transformation. In the crowd, Erin caught his eye and smiled warmly. "Dad," she said softly later, "you've given so many people a second chance, not just to remember, but to dream again." Frank nodded, his heart full. "I was never too old," he said quietly, "I just needed to find permission to matter again." The room erupted in applause, but Frank knew the real applause was the quiet moments of healing happening every day, in homes, hospitals, and hearts across the globe. As the night deepened, Frank stepped outside into the cool air, the stars above shining like distant promises. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing the journey was far from over but that the path forward was bright. Technology, courage, and compassion had converged to create something extraordinary, something that no Hollywood studio, no blockbuster film could ever replicate: the raw, beautiful truth of human life, honored and amplified by the power of connection. In that moment, Frank understood that the story wasn't just about AI or innovation. It was about reclaiming dignity, sparking joy, and building bridges across the divides of time and fear. It was about every person's right to be seen, heard, and remembered. And above all, it was about the new beginnings that await us all, no matter our age. With a final glance at the glowing community hall behind him, Frank whispered to the night, "This is just the beginning." And with that, he stepped forward into a future he was ready to shape, not as a man defeated by time, but as one empowered by the endless possibilities of change. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?